Hey guys, Brett Weiss here. Welcome to another video. I want to talk to you guys a little bit today about what I consider to be the most influential video game of all time. And as you might suspect by my shirt, I consider that to be Space Invaders, both at home and in the arcades.
Out here we entertain ourselves at home, so we got an Atari video game. There's so many different games to play. We especially like Space Invaders, zapping those little devils from outer space. It's fun, but personally I think the whole idea of creatures from outer space is a little far-fetched.
Just a huge game, huge influence that can still be felt today. Now you may be wondering, why isn't the very first video game of all time the most influential? Because it kickstarted an entire industry. Well, I consider Space Invaders to be the most influential, even though there were a lot of video games that came out before it. And let me give you a bit of an analogy to help explain a little bit my view on this. So with rock and roll, I consider the Beatles to be the most influential band of all time. They convinced a ton of what became popular acts to pick up a guitar or to play the drums or to want to front a rock band. So many groups were so influenced by the Beatles, and plus just the way they played their instruments, the way they sang, the way they wrote music, their experimental songs. So much, the Beatles just were the most influential rock band of all time, even though they were far from the first. And they were influenced by people like Buddy Holly. And Buddy Holly was a huge influence on the Stones, the Beatles, and so many other bands. But the Stones and Beatles took that and moved it forward and blew it up, and rock and roll was never the same after the Beatles hit. So I don't think a video game has to be the first video game to be the most influential. So like, it's not Willie Higginbotham's Tennis for Two. I don't think Computer Space or Pong or Ralph Baer's Magnavox Odyssey. I think Space Invaders outdid those in terms of influencing the entire industry. So let's get to it. Space Invaders came out in 1978. It was developed by Tomohiro Nishikado, and it was manufactured and sold by Taito in Japan and licensed by the Midway division of Bally for overseas distribution. It was inspired itself by Breakout, because you've got a row of bricks in Breakout to get rid of. Space Invaders, you've got a row of alien invaders to get rid of, rows and rows. And it was also influenced by Midway's Gunfight, the 1975 classic, which was one of the first games I remember playing in the arcade because of the shooting element. Shooting wasn't the biggest genre at the time Space Invaders came out, but it certainly became that later on. Space Invaders kickstarted the shooter genre like no other game. Now, Space Invaders was also influenced by Star Wars and by War of the Worlds, the classic science fiction films, and by the 1974 anime Space Battleship Yamato. It took these influences and made something completely new. So guys, very briefly, if you like retro gaming, please hit that subscribe button while you're watching. I would greatly appreciate it. And if you like this video, hit the like button. Alright, so Space Invaders kickstarted the golden age of the arcades. Before Pac-Man, before Asteroids, before Galaga, before all these games, Space Invaders became a huge mainstream success and just really kickstarted the extreme popularity of arcade gaming. Now, arcade gaming had been around a very long time before Space Invaders, but Space Invaders really brought it into the mainstream. It was a huge seller. There were so many games that were similar to Space Invaders that followed, like Centipede, like Galaxian, like Galaga, like Mooncresta, and on and on and on. Now, I distinctly recall the first time I played Space Invaders. It was in 1978. I was 11 years old. McGregor, Texas was a tiny town outside of Waco. Today it's got around 5,000 people, probably had less back then. And in this small town, there were 3 arcades. Unheard of today for a tiny little town to have 3 arcades, but a big reason for that was because of Space Invaders. Arcades popped up all over the country, in large part because of the popularity of Space Invaders. And this one arcade I went to, it was a sleazy arcade, not one of these slick mall arcades that would come along a little bit later. It was just one of these little pop-up arcades. They had 3 Space Invaders machines in this arcade, and I was just completely blown away by this game. I and no one else had ever seen anything like this before. The game was scary. The sound effects were terrifying. It's hard to imagine this today, in the era of, just truly games like survival horror games where you're terrified and, it's hard to imagine a quaint shooter like Space Invaders being scary. But it all has to do with when it came out and what came before it. And there was nothing like it beforehand. But the sound effects were like something out of Jaws or Edgar Allan Poe's Telltale Heart. That heartbeat sound, that steady sound was just super scary as the invaders descended down the screen, row by row, coming for your lone ship. So there were bunkers, but they weren't necessarily, you couldn't hide behind them forever. And plus, as the aliens kept coming down, you had to get rid of them because if they got to the bottom of the screen, it is game over. The aliens were patterned after crabs and squids, but they were obviously much scarier. And the alien invaders have become iconic. They are still on merchandising today. Very recognizable symbols. Maybe not as much as Pac-Man, but still super recognizable. The alien invaders in Space Invaders. Space Invaders would save your high score, which was really cool. It was a novelty at the time. It was the first arcade game for you to be able to do so in an arcade video game. Now, you couldn't save your initials. That would come the next year with Asteroids, but it saved your high score, which is pretty cool. Space Invaders was the first of what they used to call slide and shoot games, where you maneuver your ship or firing implement along the bottom of the screen, firing upward at enemies. It was the very first game to do that. Nowadays, they call this a fixed screen shooter. Slide and shoot is pretty much a genre name that has faded to the old days of Electronic Games Magazine. It inspired a ton of copycats. Games like Galaxian, Gorf, Centipede, Galaga, and on, including home games like Astro Smash. Amazing that one game would have so much influence, and just not only did it create so many copycats, it really kickstarted, popularized, and made mainstream the shooter genre in the arcades. And it was a big influence on vertical shooters as well. Now, when Space Invaders came out, there weren't games like vertical shooters where you progressed forward or up the screen, but Space Invaders was a big influence on that. Games like River Raid and Xevious. Space Invaders had a broader influence as well, not just on shooters. Shigeru Miyamoto said this about Space Invaders to Time magazine years ago. He said, "Before I saw it, I was never particularly interested in video games, and certainly never thought I would make video games." So, like the Beatles influenced so many rock bands, Space Invaders influenced game creators, including Shigeru Miyamoto. We may have never seen Mario or Zelda without Space Invaders. Now, Space Invaders was not only a massive influence in the arcades, it was a huge hit at home, and it really helped popularize console gaming. When Space Invaders came out for the Atari 2600 in 1980, it was the first officially licensed arcade port for a home console. Now, previous games like Circus Atari, which was based on Exidy's 1977 Circus, and Outlaw, which is based on Midway's Gunfight from 1975. Both of these are Atari 2600 games, Circus Atari and Outlaw, but they were not licensed ports. They were just clones, and there was no official licensing. But Space Invaders was the first. And the Atari 2600, back then it was known as the Atari VCS, it was the killer app for the 2600. So Space Invaders is considered to be the first killer app for a console. It quadrupled sales of the Atari 2600 or the Atari VCS, and it was a fantastic game. It looked terrific, and it had 112 game variations. Really, really cool. So Space Invaders, not only was it this massive arcade hit that popularized arcades and kickstarted the golden age of video games in the arcades, it made home console gaming super mainstream. How could this not be the most influential video game of all time? And then in later years, you had games like Space Invaders Extreme for the PSP, So the IP Space Invaders just continued on and on. Space Invaders Revolution for the DS, pretty cool. There's been a lot of Space Invaders games since, like Space Invaders Forever for the Switch, and just on and on. So Space Invaders basically made arcades popular, it made home gaming popular, and it continues today, and it created a genre, the fixed screen or slide and shoot genre for you old timers, and it was just a huge influence on vertical shooters as well. Incredible. Very briefly, I want to show you just a couple of my Space Invaders games. I've got the early release of Space Invaders for the 2600, and then later when the Atari 2600 sort of came back with the Atari 2600 Junior and everything to feed off the NES's popularity, re-released it in this box in 1988, so that's pretty cool. I'm not a huge collector of variations, but with a game like Space Invaders, I definitely wanted these. And I've got Space Invaders for the 5200, which is a much different version than the 2600. Very cool. I wish they would have made a 7800 version of Space Invaders. Anyway, before I ramble on too long, I've got a dozen runner-ups for you guys, and then we will stop the video here, and I'll let you guys comment on, you let me know what you think the most influential video game of all time is, and where I've gone wrong here. And I'm gonna give you guys a dozen runner-ups for the most influential game of all time. They couldn't quite top Space Invaders. Computer Space, Pong, Adventure for the Atari 2600, Pac-Man, Doom. Now Wolfenstein 3D predated Doom as a first-person shooter, but Doom really blew it up. Super Mario Brothers, of course, The Legend of Zelda, Tetris, Street Fighter 2, Super Mario 64, SimCity, and Grand Theft Auto 3. All right, let me know in the comments where I've gone wrong, what you think the most influential game of all time. And you can just give me, like, if you want to give me your maybe top 10 influential games of all time, or your dirty dozen or something like that. I would love to hear from you guys in the comments. Thank you for liking this video. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. I really, really appreciate it. And just thanks for being awesome. We will talk to you in another video. If you're a fan of my work, you might want to consider supporting me on Patreon. For just a low fee each month, you get a lot of extra content. Another way to support the channel and my writing career is to buy books direct from me, including the 100 Greatest Console Video Games, the Classic Home Video Game Series. It's like an encyclopedia set. And this massive bad boy, the NES Omnibus Volume 1 A through L. I will put links in the description of this video where you can buy books direct from me and where you can support me on Patreon. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.